I'm Andrew. I'm a developer for Sage. I've travelled here today from Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK. And today I'm just going to talk about a recent journey we've undergone at Sage in introducing React into a pre-existing and quite a large-scale application. So the format of the talk, I'm just going to go into a little bit of detail about why you might want to do this, and then talk about how we approached it, which will include some mistakes we made and some lessons that we learned along the way, before finally getting into some results of kind of how it's worked out for our product and for our development team. So a little bit of background first. As I said, I work for Sage. More primarily, I work on the Sage 1 product. So that's a web-based application. As you can see a screenshot here, it's for small to medium-sized businesses to help them out with their accountancy. You can get an idea of kind of, on the top there, you can see the different areas like sales invoicing, inventory, and banking. It's quite a large application. But as well as being in the UK, it's also available in all of these different regions. And that also means we have development teams in all of these different regions. So it's upwards of around 120 developers or so. So it kind of gets you a good idea of the scale of the thing that we've got live in production today. So, you know, we've got all these guys working on this daily. We've got stakeholders, we have customers who expect features and certain deadlines to be met on time. Like, what do you think their response is going to be if someone is to suggest, you know, we want to rewrite this application using a new JavaScript library? It's probably, you know, it's probably not going to be great. So first of all, let's just take a quick look at why we did it in particular. So our app's around 6 years old. It's built on Ruby on Rails. If you don't know what that is, it's not a huge issue. It's an MVC framework for building applications on the web. And it's worked out really well for us so far in terms of it's allowed us to scale really rapidly from outside of the UK to all these different regions. And even back when we first started building this, we had an idea of building it with components. So within the Ruby on Rails application, we had a Ruby part with a JavaScript part and a CSS part. But when I talk about components, I don't necessarily mean something like this, where we've just got some plain HTML markup. So for example, this show like a simple dialogue or modal. So some bits of information here. You can put like a title or some content, but it also puts in pieces like the close button, which is integral to this component. So this is kind of something that you would expect with something like Twitter Bootstrap. But when I'm talking about components, I'm talking about more reusable things. So this is just kind of some pseudo Ruby code for how we might render a modal and pass in different arguments and different parameters as well as children and have that render. The key behind this bit is the modal class, which is behind it. So for example, this might look like this with a render method to describe exactly what we're going to be rendering to the page. And really, if you're expecting to build some scalable applications, this is kind of the minimum you'd expect to use. It's kind of going under the philosophy of update once, update everywhere. So, you know, if we need to make changes to this component, we just update the base class, and that's reflected across the whole application. So, I'll give you a bit of background. It already looks like we have this component-driven architecture. Kind of what's the issue that we have? There's a few issues that we found we had. One of which is the complexity of the application. So, as well as rendering everything server-side through the Ruby component, we then pass in the browser, and we need a JavaScript side to understand what's rendered to the DOM, because it might need to manipulate that, disable things, or add or remove different elements. And as well as rendering server-side, you know, you've got direct access to the data, but once it's in the browser, we need a different way to get that data if we need to refresh things. So we would have these JSON endpoints, and we need some synchronicity there as well. And as well, you've got these components on the page. There's nothing really to communicate the interaction between each of these components, so we need an additional JavaScript layer on top of that. We need to consider what that might look like. Second issue we found is speed. So with complexity, obviously, development speed is going to be slow, but what I mean is performance in terms of what we get in the browser, and loading all this JavaScript in is going to have we were experiencing quite a large payload effect on that, so we kind of wanted to address that. And a lot of that's down to kind of using things like DOM manipulation through tools like jQuery or things like that. And thirdly, we wanted some freedom. So all of our components were built on Ruby on Rails, and really you needed Ruby on Rails to run them, which means they're not very shareable. We can't run up new services if we want unless they themselves run on Ruby on Rails. So we wanted some flexibility in kind of what we could do with these components. Most serious issue out of these, though, is the complexity, and particularly that JavaScript glue, which ties all these different interaction points together. So there's a few things that we tried. Originally, 6 years ago, we were just using plain JavaScript with some jQuery to put these interactions in. But if you've ever used this before, especially in a team with many developers, you'll find that quickly spirals out of control as developers kind of work on features that have not worked on before. You just get code layers on top of code layers, and you get this web of nasty stuff going on. So it's not a good place to be. What we thought we needed here was some better organization and some better JavaScript management. And that's kind of a couple of years into the app's life, we thought, let's have a look at some of these JavaScript MVC frameworks and see if they can help sort us out. So some of the large ones here like Angular or Ember. The problem we had at this point, though, was we weren't quite brave enough to say we want to kind of put aside everything that we've done so far with these components. We wanted to lay this stuff on top and for it to work seamlessly with it. And we found that none of these quite hit the mark for what we wanted. So we decided to take the best bits of each and to package that up into our own little in-house MVC system, which might scare a lot of people. It worked quite well at first. It was able to sit on top of our component library, but building something in-house probably isn't a good idea. There's a few issues we had with that. First of which was developer uptake. So you work in this across a large team. They need to be interested in actually learning this stuff. I mean, even if we picked Ember or Angular, if they've not worked with it before, they have to learn it. Without it in-house thing, they have to learn it, but there's limited material there for what they need to get up and running with this stuff. So interest was quite low. Secondly, we need to maintain it. So any bugs, and there will be bugs, you need to fix them yourself, and you need to understand the code behind it. You just want to hope that those core guys that put this together don't leave the business anytime soon. And thirdly, if any of your developers want to go off-road and want to do something which isn't documented and stuff, it's not like they can just go and Google this stuff. They need to depend on quite a few people for support or go and learn like the internals of the system themselves. So again, we weren't happy with where we're at this point. So where does this leave us? We have an application built on components, but we have multiple variations of JavaScript scattered through the application, and it was getting a bit of a nightmare. If you think back to the three things I outlined at first, if anything, we've probably made it more complex. We've made it slower as there's more JavaScript being loaded, and we're still tied to Rails, so there's no freedom there. So let's reconsider this initial thing, and it might seem a bit more, attractive at this point. The key to what we wanted at this point, though, was we wanted to introduce whatever this is with the least disruption as possible to the development team. So let's talk about how we went about this. We wanted whatever we chose to be open source, and we wanted it to be popular. So this is to ensure like our development team are really interested in learning this stuff and they want to get involved. I mean, even at these early stages, we opened up the discussion to the rest of the team in the business and said, what have you got experience with? What do you want to work with? That kind of gets us an idea of, what's gonna be the best fit for us. We also wanted some flexibility. So whatever we chose, we didn't want to be absolutely tied. We didn't want to be tied to Rails. We wanted the freedom to move to different projects. But we also didn't want to be too tied into whatever we chose in terms of, is it a huge framework of stuff. And this is where React comes in. So has anyone actually got any experience with React and used it before? Can you show hands? Yeah? So I'll just give you a quick explanation for those that aren't aware. It'll kind of give you an idea of why we chose it. So unlike those MVC libraries that we looked at before, React just takes care of the view part of that, or just the components. If you have a look at a generic kind of data flow for that, we would have the data coming from the database or the server and flow that into a React component. And all the React component does is, with this data, I'm going to describe how it should be rendered to the page, and that goes into the browser. So the cool thing about that is if the data ever changes at the top, it gets fed into the same component, and the component just says, all right, I'll make these changes, I'll render what's described in this component. And the developers writing this stuff don't have to worry about doing DOM manipulations themselves in terms of, oh, do I need to disable this thing? Do I need to remove this thing? React will take care of all that stuff for you, and it'll do it in a really fast way. So let's have a quick look at an actual component. So using the example from before, we've got a modal, and again, it's just describing what's going to get rendered to the page here, and we have the different extension points, such as title or whatever children, but we also have bits which are relative to the component itself, like the close button. So it's running with that philosophy of update once, update everywhere. And one thing to note from this is just JavaScript, but you'll get things like this HTML-like structure in there, which we call JSX. It's even becoming more commonplace to start putting CSS into these components as well, which for a lot of developers seeing this for the first time can make them feel a bit queasy. I quite think it's appropriate to this one of Principal Skinner. It's kind of the normal developers thinking of when they see this for the first time. But when you start working with it, you come to understand all these things are kind of intrinsic to what you're getting with the user interface in terms of the markup and the interactions, and even the styling to some extent. And I guess in the past you've kind of had this separation of concerns because you've relied on the server-side rendering for that markup, which is still really integral to what you want to do. You need it for accessibility or SEO. But React's kind of bridging that gap now as they support server-side rendering, so it's less of an issue, and it kind of allows you to follow on with this format. So how's that going to fit in with our Ruby on Rails application? Well, React is just components, so it's a very lightweight thing, and we can just theoretically just drop this into existing pages in the application. So it's kind of, we saw it as our opportunity to think, yeah, we can start building this and rewriting the application in an iterative way. So I'll go into a bit more detail about how we did this exactly. Phase one, we just took a small team and wanted to do some research and development. So this is just our opportunity to kind of start prototyping as much stuff as possible, try and understand and learn everything we can about React and how it works, and just kind of figure out all the issues before we hand it over to the rest of the team to cause as minimum disruption as possible. So a few things we wanted to figure out at this point is, can we and how do we render into existing views? With obviously the long-term goal of replacing all of this, all of the UI with React. But React kind of lends itself really well to this, as it is just components. And as I mentioned earlier, the only issue you really need to consider with this point is the server-side rendering, and it's quite a established library now, and there's lots of kind of whatever environment or stack you use, and there's generally something there which will enable that for you. And for us, we had React Rails, which does the job really well. Second thing we wanted to look at was then how do we build entire views in React. At this point, you're going to start considering the data management tools that are out there, and that's the ones recommended by React, obviously Flux, and you've got stuff like Redux. There's a whole host of other ones, including like a load which use every reference to Back to the Future possible. But if you haven't used Flux, I'd definitely recommend going away and having a look and learning about it. It kind of simplifies a lot of the MVC stuff in terms of instead of the two-way data binding which you get with stuff like Ember, you've just got the unidirectional data flow, which makes things so much easier to reason with. One key thing we wanted at this point, though, is to ensure that whatever library of components we make, keep that abstracted from whatever data thing sits on top, just to maintain that flexibility. If we ever want to change from Flux to Redux, we can, or something totally different, chuck Angular in there, like why not? Third thing we wanted to figure out was asset management. So we come from this world of Ruby on Rails handling everything. Now we might want to use tools like ES6 or modular classes through JavaScript, and we're probably going to package that all up with some kind of node-based tool like Browserify or Webpack. So at this point, we thought it'd be easier, and it made more sense to kind of pull that UI out of the Rails application itself. So if you imagine in the past, everything's in this Rails ecosystem. Why not try and get some simplicity there by pulling that out, like break the monolith down somewhat? Is if you keep it going this way, you'll find that your releases are really complicated. You've got a whole bunch of code, whether it's server-side or front-end, all going out at once. It makes the release process much harder. So if we do that properly, we could do it versioned. We could deliver that content through a CDN instead, and it keeps those two things abstracted. Fourthly, at this stage, we wanted to have a look at how we're going to access data. So we still need to get data and retrieve data from the server. And this is where you might have a look at stuff as React recommends, stuff like GraphQL or Relay. I'm not going to go into too much detail about these, but again, if you haven't heard of them, I would definitely recommend going away and having a look. It's a really interesting way to do APIs and endpoints. Being on a Rails app, though, we already had the concept of RESTful interfaces and endpoints, so we thought it was probably best to continue with that, particularly since we already had an API in development. It was only up until this point, though, that we weren't using this in the web app itself. This was mainly just built so we could start developing mobile applications or allowing third parties to interact with our data. But we thought, we've got this thing, it exists, it's fully documented and versioned. Why wouldn't we use this in the web as well? So that's exactly what we're going to start doing. And you get the added benefit there that the web team are also working to this, contributing to this. They're going to make it even better. So if we look back at this model again, we've got the JavaScript coming from the CDN. We're interacting with Rails through this API, or this interface. So why not just, this gives us the opportunity to do things like even just serve the web pages or do the server-side rendering through a little microservice, whatever that may be. It kind of opens up that flexibility. So that would be the end of phase one, kind of doing the research and development. We've got a rough idea of loads of documentation of kind of what we think we should be doing. The only thing left before we start giving this to teams is to start this component library, which is why we've started putting together the Carbon React component base. So this just provides our team with basically what we had with the Ruby components, but a React version of that. So we now go into phase two, and we want to actually put this research and development to the test and see if we can actually build something and get it into production. So there's a couple of ways that we can do this safely. You could either build something which is totally isolated from anything else in the application, would be safe to deploy and work with, or you can use something like an A/B service. So I would definitely recommend this way if you can. It just gives you more control over what you're deploying and when you're deploying it. You can roll things back easily. It gives you the opportunity to show things to customers early and get feedback on things and iterate on things. It's a much safer way to do it. So with the feature in mind and implementation together, give it to a different team within the research and development team. like one of your actual dev teams, and get them to start building this thing. By giving it to them, you can evaluate their approach. We can hit any teething issues that we may have before giving it to the wider development team, and just collect their feedback based on what they're building. And what we found is, it was much enjoyable to work with. We were able to work on things a lot faster with a lot more freedom. It was a lot more easy to reason with, and it was just general positivity. It looked like we were heading in the right direction. If there was one thing I kind of would have liked to have noticed at this point, it was we were working in this accounting application, and in the past it was all kind of combined together in one single repository because everything's in this Rails ecosystem. And even though we'd separated the front end and the JavaScript, we're still committing everything to the same repository. Everyone's committing to this thing daily, and that's just going to get worse and worse. And different teams are going to block other teams in terms of what they want to get merged into master. So instead, what we're going with these days is we've broken down that UI and actually pulled it out into separate repositories based on different features in the application. So for example, we'll have invoicing UI or banking UI or inventory UI with the carbon components in its own thing as well. And that will eventually feeds back into the main application. And you get some additional benefits with this as well. I mean, you got they can each have their own version and life cycles, and but additionally, we can also, since the JavaScript here is kind of separated from the application and we're interacting via an API and things, we could set up little development servers for each of these so we don't have to pull in the whole application to work on it. We can just have teams work on just the invoice and UI if we need to. So we're breaking down complexity even further with that. So at the end of phase 2, we've got a couple of features hopefully deployed to production. We've worked through a lot of the teething issues which they found. We're ready to hand this over to the wider team. And at this point we can say any new features, any new work, start building it in React and with our component library. Key to this phase though is going to be providing enough support to make sure your team can hit the ground running. So our team in particular, we're all used to working in this Rails ecosystem, but now we're throwing in things like Browserify or Webpack, and which have their own build tasks and spec runners and things like that. There's a lot of dependencies in that. So we wanted to package up something which we could give to them, just say, install this, and you're ready to start working. And that's where we came up with the Carbon Factory package. So again, we just kept this separate from the core library of things. It gives us that flexibility to say, the library itself, you can reuse this with any build task you want, but we've got something here if you just want to get up and running quick. And if you consider all the different dependencies which might be involved with this, we can kind of manage that in one central place and update things as we need to, especially if we find new tools which we think will benefit the company. If there's any of these, though, in particular that I recommend you install, it will be the ESLint tool. And just run with the rule of lint first and ask questions later, as this is kind of bit us in the terms that we had a linting from the get-go, but we only had maybe a select few rules to begin with. And we found it's much easier if you just install as many rules as possible at first and pull out the ones you don't like. Otherwise, you'll be going back and you install new rules, and you'll find that you probably have hundreds, if not thousands, of errors that you need to work through. I mean, they can be pretty good in terms of they'll automatically fix your code for you, but you still want to double check that it hasn't broken anything. As well as linting, you might consider, actually, to install your rules, just use the Airbnb package, as they've got a well-curated list of ones in particular for React development. But as well as linting, you can install some things like TypeScript or Flow, which lets you do some static type analysis. And again, this might ease your development team if they're not too familiar with these new technologies which you're introducing to them. So as well as these development tools, a few of the things you want to make sure you have at a baseline, just some good solid documentation, whether that's just well-documented code or you're providing guides and tutorials. As well as that, you could run some workshops. This just ensures that you can get your teams to set aside a full day, put something in the calendar and say, come along and we'll work together through these exercises and things. Gives the opportunity to have a bit more fun and interactivity with it, and to get any questions and answers from them. However, workshops might not be fully possible if you've got people in different cities or different countries, so screencasts can help out with that. I'll just make sure to try and keep these short and focused in terms of kind of encouraging developers to actually go through them, and it also helps you maintain them if they get out of date and you need to replace them. So with all that together, you can put a demo site together for your dev team. So this is one that we've put together for our library, and it houses all of the guides and tutorials, and it also puts together a load of documentation for the React components. So you can see at the bottom there, it outlines the API for each of the components, and then in the middle, you can play around with those different properties, and it'll update the actual demo at the top as well as the code that the developer needs to use within that configuration. So it's quite an invaluable tool, this, to share with the team, not only for the developers, but also for your design team if you have one. So the design team can use this as just a reference point, really, to see all of the different components that are available and all the different configurations. That kind of leads into one other point for this phase. You know, if you do have a design team, work as closely as possible with them. It should really be the design team that owns these components. As you know, these are the guys that are putting together the visuals, which they'll hand over to the developers. If they know the component library inside out, they can take these designs and say, you know, this is made of this component, this component. This component doesn't exist, so we expect you to build that. You know, if they're taking ownership of it as well, we've noticed that, you know, the guys are now designing components which are designed with configurability in mind. So they're handing over designs saying, you know, this is a component, this is what it will look like in all these different contexts. And it kind of gives the developer that scope of, you know, previously they might have been blind in terms of, I'm just building this feature, but now I'm building this component which is going to be used in all of these different scenarios. So where's this got us? So far, we're probably partway through phase 3 in terms of what we're working on at stage 1. If we go back to the original 3 points that I made, we'll see if we've worked through these. So the complexity, you know, instead of going through the Ruby into the JavaScript, into jQuery and MVC and all this stuff, we've kind of, you know, stripped that all away and said, you know, going through React or Flux and Redux, which is a much more manageable thing, much easier thing to understand and to maintain with bugs and adding new features. We've made a clear distinction now as well between what we have in the UI, the data interaction layer with the API and the server, so we can release things independently of one another, like versioned, and it makes that release process a lot easier. And generally, we're just seeing a faster turnover of these things being built and getting into production. I mean, so much so now that we're at a place where we can consider just taking a full screen and saying, let's rebuild this. You know, previously we might have thought, let's rebuild this. This is going to take 6 months because there's so much functionality in there. But now we can say, let's rebuild this and let's do it right, and we can get that done a lot quicker. Certainly speed. So, you know, complexity is down, so development speeds up. You're going to get that initial dip as, you know, your development teams need to learn this stuff, but ultimately we found it definitely worthwhile in terms of where we're at now. In terms of performance and speed, you know, we're doing much less full page reloads and things like that. So, you know, I think our worst culprit was up to 8 seconds in terms of getting to a page and loading all the assets in and getting it functional, ready for the user to use. Whereas now we can do things like much more dynamic reloading of the UI through React, so we're getting much more instantaneous results. You know, just waiting on getting the data through the API as well, which is a lot faster. Thirdly, we've now got a lot more freedom. So our component library itself, you know, it's just React now. It's just JavaScript. We can use that across any different framework. We're not stuck on using Ruby on Rails. So, you know, at Sage, we're working on the Sage 1 product, but we have multiple products within Sage, all of which are under the same brand and building similar accountancy software with, you know, same components and things. So, you know, why not reuse this stuff across the business? You know, if we've got a global design team behind it, who can control things like brand and what components are going in, we go back to this philosophy of update once and update everywhere. And that's going to, you know, really help us in the future. It also means that since we've got this detached library now, you know, we can share it wider and share it amongst, you know, the public, which is why we've now open sourced this library. So you can install this today with npm install Carbon React, or, you know, yarn if that's what you prefer. We've also made the demo site public through carbon.sage.com. So, you know, there's our opportunity now to give back to the community. You know, originally at the start of this journey, we were researching how other organizations have tackled the same issues, and now we can share our experiences with everyone. It's probably important to say as well now, we're actively recruiting as well in Poland, so if you're interested in working with us and making this stuff better, you know, get in touch. We've got to stand out in the main hall. That's everything for today. Thanks.